Alright, response video, I think, to Anekantavad video, I suppose. So he said some weird things. He chimed in on this whole Inmendham thing, and it all comes down to some sort of mush with him about, everybody's irrational, which I don't think is useful. And yeah, it just doesn't make any. It doesn't mean anything. And then he ends his video with some sort of statement like, "I don't think people can be condemned for being what they are." As if that's supposed to mean something. Coming from a guy who, in the video, basically just points out that because his consciousness is not going to migrate through another life, or to another universe, or to a spirit world, that somehow it doesn't matter what happens here, and it's just totally irrelevant. That whatever suffering happens is just to be observed, and if you're entertained by it, fine, all the better, but it has no meaning. And so what's the point of, quite obviously by your philosophy, there would be no such thing as useful condemnation if you don't believe in value. There would be no point in pointing out something's inefficiency if you place no value on the gasoline. So if gasoline was free, it didn't have any value, and you could waste as much of it as you wanted, well, of course, it would be stupid for somebody to be running around going, "That's inefficient, that's a waste, that's a waste, that's a waste." There'd be no point in doing that. If there was no coal miners that had to die in the coal mine, there'd be no point in pointing to something, calling it waste. So of course you don't care. Of course you have no use for this idea of guilt or condemnation or judgment or any of this stuff, because you've negated the whole purpose of judgment. If there's no value, obviously there's no judgment. I mean, it's just, obviously. You're saying basically there's no math. If there's no math, there's no need for numbers. There's no need to put them on scales. There's no reason to do anything. So, there's nowhere to go with that as a premise. So that's his premise. It doesn't matter. Okay? Whether there's World War III or not doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. So yeah, how do you argue with that? You just can't. So that's a dead end from my perspective. Yeah, that's irrational, unreasonable, and useless junk. So I'm going to argue from my case, the simplest of the argument, just the basic outline, and say, this guy says this is irrational. He says this, that I'm going to say right now, is irrational. Okay? And it effectively does say what he argues, that at the core of the universe, I wouldn't argue is evil. I'm going to argue that it's ignorant. All right, it doesn't have a purpose or a function. Somebody's doing some tree cutting, which is nice. Saves me the trouble. My chainsaw is a little dull. Yeah, good. How you doing? See him cut this tree. Anyway, I guess they're doing it for the horses. Oh, they're horse trails. So anyway, where was I? Alright, so the simple argument I'm making is that we have this truth of evolution. We have the consumption, reproduction, cannibalism, addiction thing. Alright, we got these basic mechanisms. The machinery of evolution creates this thing called a psychology. The psychology manifests motivational feelings. We have a rational, reasonable intelligence to help satisfy, to be a tool, to help satisfy the tool that is our psychology. So our psychology is a tool in creating motivation, then our intelligence is a tool in creating a mechanism, a tool that enables you to gain the satisfaction of the needs and desires created in the psychology. And the psychology manifests this idea of attraction and repulsion to create a mechanism of learning So it's a good, carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments, essentially to condition the organism to attempt to get to maximize its function in an environment. The basic function in the crude natural form is highly selfish to individual genetic code, generally speaking, family code, clan code, yes, through culture and sophistication and edification, we've become a little better than that. We're not quite the bigots that we were 50,000 years ago. We're certainly capable of being a little better. But the basic functional mechanism is still the same. We're still animals of emotion, animals of conditioning, and our psychology, our desire mechanism is still substantially defining what the goals are for the organism. And I'm arguing that through intelligence you can see the weakness of those goals, that those goals have vacuous function in a civilization, and that the real goals should be defined by our intelligence. And if our intelligence looks at the board, looks at the game, and attempts to define a goal, a real goal of some kind of substance besides individual ego aggrandizement, it will find that there is no real goal beyond minimizing how much fuel you're wasting. And once you start minimizing waste, just like I've used the metaphor, but once you start pulling weeds out of life, you will eventually pull everything, because it's all weeds. And that's why the Martians aren't missed, is because it's weeds. And there's no weeds on Mars, because that's all there can be in the universe. It grows weeds. It doesn't grow anything else. And so it is a discouraging, plainly unaggrandizing, unsatisfactory. How you doing? Yes, a certain death.
Good Lord.
So there's nothing in the truth that is at all good news. And what I'm arguing is that what I've just described, in my opinion, is a rock-solid, rational description of our reality, that we are just psychologies that have presumed that are projecting value and not recognizing value. The real value is in the suffering, and the projected values of Red Sox winning the World Series, our human race living for 1,000 million more years, or all this other crap that is projected as a value, is just that crap. And the game is far too inefficient. It's squandering way too much, wasting way too much fuel, and producing no useful motion because there's nowhere to go. It's a car and there's no roads, and you're just burning gas, spinning wheels, would be the metaphor. Now you show me the irrationality, the unreasonableness, the logical flaw, the outrageous claim, the unsubstantiated claim, the clearly and obviously more brilliant competing theory. Show me the competing theory of truth that it has more rational foundation, that has a more provable or demonstratable qualification. You can't do that. So anyway, qualification is another concept I want to get to, because that's part of this too, is there's this claim of no obligation to be qualified by any measure. There's just this, Anekantavad basically said, I can't remember his exact words, but they were almost like, you're allowed to be an imbecile, and you're not only allowed to not have your actions judged, you're not even allowed to have your judgment judged. It's gotten that bad. And that really, if you're going to, in my opinion, it's totally unreasonable for somebody to sit there and say, I will do something that will have impact in the world, and I will do it without having either qualifying my capacity to judge, which means qualifying my intelligence, my understanding of the mechanism, my understanding and some work I've done to gain knowledge of how the world works. So I won't qualify myself with a knowledge base, nor, will I qualify the action itself and explain how it's reliable and dependable, that I have reason to believe that the risk is not excessive. That kind of thing. So again, it's just this blanket evasion of any sense of obligation to conform to the very nature of the word reasonable or rational. So he'll accuse me of being irrational from a point where he already has negated the ability to even make such a judgment. I mean, it's just kind of outrageous. You can't negate your obligation to satisfy rational standards and then apply rational standards and call something else irrational, with the assumption that somehow you know what rational is. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, it makes no sense at all. So again, point out the competing rational theory and point out any constituent of my theory that is on its face, as it's stated, irrational, are not logically consistent, not coherent to the evidence. So show an incoherency to evidence, or else quit making baseless accusations that because your beliefs are irrational, that everybody's beliefs are irrational. That is just totally bogus. I'm not only willing to defend my qualifications to have an opinion, in the sense that I've done the work to acquire the knowledge of the systems and understand their mechanisms and how they function, but I'll also qualify the explicit, detailed statements that I assert to be accurate descriptions of reality. I certainly will defend the theory of evolution. I'll defend the theory of our acquisition of a psychology. I will defend the theory that our intelligence has merely been a scheming tool for the gratification of that psychology. I'll defend all of that as not a theory, but as a theory of truth, and one that can't be argued to be irrational either because there exists a competing theory that's better, or because any part of that theory is not substantially defended by evidence. Buckets and buckets and buckets of evidence. So anyway, there. So it really isn't that complicated, really. It's the evolution thing, the psychology thing, the intelligence thing, and the key element of the psychology thing is the mechanism of desire, because it creates projections of value, subjective projections of value, individual projections of value. They are not philosophical statements. They are not statements of truth. They are subjective, personal statements of truth that have nothing to do. They're truths for the individual, not truths of the world. They are just bigotries. They are preferences and prejudices. And they have no meaning philosophically. and the value of the negative sensation versus the positive sensation is intrinsic, fundamental, universal, and cannot be, there's no rational alternative theory that could possibly convert horrific suffering into joyful happiness. It is not joyful happiness. They're two different categories. They belong in those, the two categories are legitimate, rock solid. One contains things to be avoided. One contains things to be preferential toward. Okay, now I'm done. Pretty much. But again, not much. This is not complicated. So if you're going to make a claim of my irrationality, quote it, demonstrate it, prove it, argue it with something other than your unqualified opinion, your unqualified accusation. Qualify it, or don't make it. I mean, really, if you're not going to qualify your opinion, you're not really entitled to it. Really. It's only logical. Yeah, such. Till next time.